Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.
Welcome to Superhumanize, where we explore the frontiers of human potential and the complex tapestry of consciousness. Today, we have an extraordinary guest, one of the most controversial and transformative thinkers of our time, Dr. Marc Gafni. Marc is not just a philosopher, he's a revolutionary mind, a master teacher, and a provocateur who challenges us to rethink the very fabric of our reality. Marc Gafni is known for his groundbreaking source code teachings that delve into the profound depths of spirituality, ethics, and human connection. His theories, such as the unique self, CosmoErotic Humanism, and the transition from Homo sapiens to Homo Amor, are not just philosophical musings, they're calls to action for a global reawakening, a radical shift in how we view ourselves and our collective story. In this episode, we talk about Marc's latest work, First Principles and First Values, where he collaborates with other visionary thinkers like Ken Wilber and Zach Stein to chart a path through the metacrisis facing our civilization. This book is a manifesto for the future of humanity, where love, value, and the essence of what it means to be human are redefined in the most fundamental ways. We'll explore some of the most pressing questions of our time. How do we confront the root cause of evil? What does it mean to reclaim our collective narrative as a love story? And how do we ensure that emerging technologies serve to enhance rather than undermine our journey toward becoming Homo Amor? Marc's insights are intellectually stimulating, and they challenge us to integrate spiritual enlightenment, ethical living, and the art of meaningful relationships into our everyday lives. This is a conversation that promises to push boundaries and invites you into a new way of seeing the world. Marc, welcome to the Superhumanize podcast. Really good to connect with you.
Yay, I'm delighted to be here, Lady A, and this is a big conversation. Let's do it.
Yes, a really big conversation, a really big and important book. First Principles and First Values, 42 propositions on cosmoerotic humanism, the metacrisis, and the world to come. That's quite a mouthful, and it stretched my brain in the best ways. It also is a collaboration between you, Zach Stein, and Ken Wilber, our co-authors of the book. And you are also co-founders of a think tank. This is part of a bigger project, vision you're working on. Can you tell us a little bit more about the entire background, Marc?
With delight and some urgency and some ecstatic urgency and some trembling before the reality that we're in all the ways that we tremble. So the think tank, I founded the think tank with my dear friend Ken Wilber in 2011. And we founded it initially to actually try and create a shared vision of spirit, of world spirituality or world religion, that although we didn't use the word religion, we specifically used only the word spirituality then. That's changed, right? Which would actually unpack the deepest structures, the deepest depth structures of all of the great world traditions and weave them together into a larger whole, meaning not a kind of vapid pluralism where, for example, like in early ecumenicism, in the early 60s, it was like Jews who didn't believe in Judaism met Christians who didn't believe in Christianity and discovered they had a lot in common, right? So in other words, that's not the kind of ecumenicism we were interested in. We were interested in and are still, what are the depth structures, the unique contributions of what I call the unique self of every great tradition, weave them together into a larger whole, which we then call the world spirituality. That's how we began. But very rapidly, we became aware of the metacrisis. Not long afterwards, Zach Stein joined us as the academic director. And Zach started studying with me in kind of a formal teacher-student relationship, but he's also my dear friend and also my interlocutor and partner in this great enterprise. And we became deeply aware of the metacrisis. And by the metacrisis, I would call the metacrisis, we use the term the second shock of existence.
So tell us about the first shock first.
First shock, right? So can't get to a second shock before a first shock. And it's the first shock of existence is at the dawn of humanity when we have a realization of death. Now, even if you have a direct sense of the continuity of consciousness beyond death, which I do, and I think we appropriately do, nonetheless, death is shocking. So that the experience of death, meeting death, presses me into life. And it demands that I make meaning, but not just create meaning, but discover meaning. So the first shock of existence is the meeting with the raw experience, I will die. The skull grins at the banquet.
Right. Mm-hmm.
The death of the human being.
Mm-hmm.
The second shock of existence is the death of humanity. Mm-hmm. And the death of humanity is what we've called existential risk, right? Existential risk to our very existence. But it has two forms. One is actually the actual death of humanity, right? And it's the potential of an extinction event. And there's multiple writers over the last 30 years, probably about 20 really good books that have written about that. We're actually working, our broad circle is working on probably the best document today, integrating all of that material into an analysis, the best analysis of existential risk, the death of humanity. And that's actually real. That's actually a genuine option, which is a real possibility, which is blithely ignored by white kids in Silicon Valley who are boys who are 24 years old to 40, who don't have good sex lives, who don't know how to get along. but it's actually accurate. It's funny and it's tragic. In other words, they don't know how to navigate the world.
Yeah.
They don't know how to do relationship. They have a very narrow, specialized skill. They're egoically, wildly ambitious and somewhat deformed, right? And this narrow group of people, maybe a couple hundred of them, right, living on the West Coast of the United States, are actually reshaping the lives without any kind of regulation of billions of people in the world. So it's and what they have potential to cause death of humanity. And I'd say the primary vector of risk there is AI. We're not going to go down, that's not our topic today. But artificial intelligence is quite a serious vector of risk. And what we just saw happening recently in OpenAI, when Sam Altman was thrown out and then made his way back in with Satya Nadella from Microsoft, was really about him pulling the brakes off the caution that's actually needed around the expansion of AI. So now the caution was thrown to the wind, and the people on that board who were actually counseling intense caution were essentially thrown off. The break between Elon Musk and Larry Page was really Larry Page saying, who cares if humanity dies? And when he basically says, Musk, you're a speciesist. You're too worried about human beings surviving. Why do you prefer human beings? And there's this general blithe kind of talking in this Silicon Valley group. Was carbon, and then there'll be silicon. Almost in this kind of, that's the death of humanity. But the second kind of death is really the death of our humanity.
And before we go into that, Marc, I want to underscore what you just said. And
Please.
It's not just AI. When we look at the very few who are in power of technology and of the development of technology, the real danger is, as you so aptly said, these are mostly white boys. Let's not even call them men. I think my definition of what a man is probably quite different from the purely biological, chronological age definition. So these boys who are deformed or lacking emotionally and sexually, and in a lot of ways do not really have true agency over their highest selves. So these very few are basically encoding technology with their very arbitrary values versus someone creating technology based on intrinsic value, which is actually something you really focus on and champion.
Yeah.
The big issue here is, how do we change this? Can we change this from the grassroots up, or from the perspective of, I'm not a technology person, I consume it, I use it to put content out, and hopefully that reaches people and can also inspire thoughts and maybe even change certain thoughts that are rooted in old thinking. But so how do we change this, especially in a world that's increasingly mediated by technology and that's commodified?
No, that's great. So let's see if we can take a look at this. So let me just I'll spend one more second on the distinction between if it's the death of humanity and the death of our humanity. And then let's go to your critical inquiry, which is, so what do we do? And you've already pointed towards, and it's really essential in this book, First Principle and First Values. It's got to do with value at its core, but it's got to do with value and with the Eros and within. So let's like spend most of our time in that. But first, I want to, just so we don't leave your listeners hanging, when we say the death of our humanity, what's the difference between the death of humanity? So the death of humanity is we're not here, or most of humanity is not here. It's a kind of catastrophic risk event, existential risk event. Death of our humanity is we're all here. Looks fine. But we've created a planetary stack which becomes essentially a Skinner's box. Skinner, a key psychologist at Harvard for 6 decades, who writes a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and an earlier book in 1947 called Walden 2. And Walden 2 is about not Thoreau's Walden, which is about, ethics, values, reliance. It's Walden 2, meaning how do I turn society into what he calls Walden 2, which is the name of a city. It's a fictional city. But the idea is, if you read between the lines, is that Walden 2 is a Skinner's box. Now, to be clear, a Skinner's box means you've got rats and pigeons in the box, and you assert through what Skinner calls invisible technologies of control, and I'm quoting, you assert control through creating positive reinforcements or certain schedules of inconsistent reinforcement. There's a series of ways you do it. And you basically, without the rat and pigeon knowing, you control their choices. So Skinner says you can actually up-level those technologies to actually turn all of reality, the entire world, into a Skinner's box. So his Walden 2 novel, which is published a year before George Orwell's 1984. So Orwell's 1984 is about an overt totalitarianism. China is Orwellian, but the United States and the rest of open society could actually become, in some sense, a Skinner's box, and ultimately, so will the whole world will be. The Skinner's box means we live inside of an immersive environment called the web, which actually, without our knowing that it's happening, asserts technologies of control, which undermine our free will, our essential ability to choose, which shape our desire without our knowing that it shapes our desire, which shape our thoughts, shape our choices, shape our direction, shape our value. And all of that happens without our having any idea that it's even happening. Now, that is the Skinnerian goal. Now, we might say, who cares? Some guy named Skinner. But actually, and I'm excited is a strange word, but I'm excited together with Zach. We're putting out the next book that we're putting out is it's called Turning the World into a Skinner's Box. And it's a 200,000 word detailed analysis of Skinner and the writings of the MIT Media Lab and its key players, and showing that the MIT Media Lab, that's at the very center of the Techplex, and the key Silicon Valley design labs are intentionally, not my friend Russell Brand going crazy in a podcast with kind of mixed evidence and it's confusing. And what is he saying? But actually, with all due respect, Russell, but in other words, a careful analysis of the core texts that form the Techplex tell us that we've identified the 23 core principles that define and the design of technology are directly and intentionally based on the behaviorist psychologist B.F. Skinner, who believes that free will doesn't exist, that human choice doesn't exist, that love is not real, that the world is purely material. So the hidden truth that hasn't actually been exposed is that the Techplex is run based on those set of ideas. That's the death of our humanity. And I'll just give you one dumb example, and then there's one example among 1,000, but I'll just give you one simple example. We think we have democracy in the United States. We're Germany. Actually, Barack Obama's internet campaign in 2008 and in 2012 was run by Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt was the head of Google. He was the appointed kind of head of Google. Eric Schmidt was the person in 2002, 3, 4 who actually developed the notion of reality mining, meaning we're going to mine your digital exhaust, is the word they used, from the web. We're going to take all of your data, but your data doesn't mean people think my data is which pornography site did I go to? No one cares about that. We're uninterested. Have a nice day. It's more like, how long did your finger hover before you click the mouse, which is part of a pattern. What's your pattern of typing, right? How do you respond? We split test. How do you respond to a sequence, right? In the sequence, there's a cat, and there's a blue font, and then there's a sock, and then there's these, and it's a sequence, let's say a 3-second sequence. So Facebook is, for example, or Twitter, not Twitter, or TikTok is constantly split testing how you respond to sequences that try and get you to do something. And they keep split testing and split testing and split testing until they put you in what they call a peer group, which is the group of people that statistically have parallel, ingrained, invisible patterns, which you can manipulate. Now, those are organized by machine intelligence, which means this machine intelligence, which is the most powerful force we have in the world. In other words, the machine intelligence of today is exponentially more powerful than Deep Blue that beat Boris Kasparov in chess 25 years ago. And Deep Blue, the machine intelligence program, is a joke compared to the machine intelligence we have today. So you have asymmetric power. All of machine intelligence in the world is focused on knowing you so well, much better than you know yourself, and in order to decipher what's called the patterns of your fast thinking. Daniel Kahneman wins the Nobel Prize in the split between fast thinking and slow thinking. Your fast thinking is habitual, automatic, unconscious, and subject to manipulation. Last sentence, Skinner, his book Beyond Freedom and Dignity, he says, we don't care about the inner man. Page 200, if you want to look it up. Page 200, he says, we have to abolish the inner man. The only thing that matters about man is that which is, quote, observable and manipulable. That's the Techplex. That's the death of our humanity.
So I have a question for you, because
Please.
this is really big and a lot to take in. I've been down that rabbit hole. So for me at this point, it's not new. However, I remember the very first time I was even exposed to these kinds of thoughts and of what's going on behind the scenes. It can be, in my personal case, not everybody may react like this, I was frozen and just horrified for quite a while, right? So for anyone out there listening and it's their first time hearing this, there's nothing wrong with reacting.
You're totally right. And we've up-leveled it significantly. In other words,
exactly. What can we do? Somebody who's sitting here, okay, this is effed up beyond measure. So what can we do?
That's great. That's great. So just two things, right? And then we'll get to what can we do. And we'll also get back to, okay, so how do we actually respond to the Techplex? How do we respond to this whole thing? But first, what we tried to do with this forthcoming book on turning reality into a Skinner's box is take this out of claims on podcasts which are happening all over the place, which are actually unsourced, often not true, contrived conspiracy theory. Now, some conspiracy theories are, of course, true, right? In other words, we dismiss things as conspiracy theories in order to dismiss a careful analysis of them. But we try to basically throw all of that out and actually say, okay, let's look at very carefully in the most rigorous way the actual core texts of civilization. So it's like when Marx sat in the library for 12 years at the British Museum, and he just, okay, what's really going on here? So what we're trying to do at the center, myself and Zach, Ken, and the whole gang, is to actually, we've tried to step out of public culture. We're just after 5-6 years, we've all refused to do pretty much any podcasts. Like we've really tried to avoid the churn of public culture, which is important and beautiful and necessary and gorgeous. But we realized, and we're gonna continue to do that. We're going to occasionally do a podcast here and there. We're going to put the books out and trying to enact the great library. And I'm madly delighted to be talking to you and honored. But we're trying to say, okay, what's the root? So what I'm describing here is based on a very careful analysis of Skinner, the MIT Media Lab. By the way, the key figure in the MIT Media Lab, his name is the guy who founded the lab. And by the way, and he's not a demon. I'd be delighted to have him over for dinner. So I want to be clear. I'm also not doing the green lizard demonization move. That's not helpful. Right? His name is Alex Pentland, and he's enormously ambitious. And he's a reductive materialist who believes you should turn the world into a Skinner's box. He's engages in euphemism. So one of the things we point out in our writing is that there's about 10 words that he euphemistically deploys to avoid you knowing what he's talking about. So instead of calling it a Skinner's box, or what Skinner called an operant conditioning chamber, that was Skinner's word for Skinner's box, right? Pentland calls it, he says we have to turn the world into a living laboratory. Now that sounds fantastic. The world of the living laboratory, what he means is that basically everyone's a rat, right? And you have immediate information about how to control the rat. And by the way, the musical group that had a sense of fragrance of Skinner and wrote a song about it, right, in the 60s was Simon and Garfunkel, like a rat in a maze, is actually precisely their intuitive, they got the fragrance of the Skinnerian move. That's wow. Okay, so now what do we do? Okay, what do we do? What do we do? So now this brings us to part 2 of the conversation. And with permission, Lady A, and with permission from all of your viewers, we're now going to just deep pause, deep inside. And now we're going to literally complete the whole conversation. Now changes. Okay, so we've framed this challenge. So I want to throw something kind of quite complex on the table for about a minute. And then we're going to broad and wide and move into the world of Eros and value and play. Okay. So first, we go a little crazy for a second, though. So everybody, if you can bear with one more second of craziness, but this is just to be clear to everyone. This is my way of really honoring everyone, right? And of course, honoring your depth, which is self-evident, so that we're not throwing out slogans or declarations, right? We're actually trying to say, what's the depth of this? That when we come to something that sounds like a slogan, it's not a slogan, it's actually a deep capturing of what's actually happening. So I want to flip back to, let's say, 1947. And there's a dude named Turing, right? Who's, of course, the originator of the Turing machines for the early computers, right? They made a movie about him. What was it called? Imitation Game, I think. He cracked the codes in World War II. He's a fascinating figure. He was a gay man in Great Britain in the early 50s, and he was arrested for soliciting a young man, and they pumped him with estrogen and killed him, essentially. It's a very tragic story. He dies in 1952, right? And how that happened exactly, we're not sure, but there's no version of that story that's good. But he's a beautiful man. I'm just this gorgeous human being. And you're right, he goes to Bell Lab. I think it's like 47, and he writes an essay called Morphogenesis, which is the seminal essay. And let's skip the mathematics, and it has many dimensions, but let's just talk about one dimension. He's trying to figure something out. How do you get coherent complexity in a world filled with so many individual parts? How do you get coherence? Where does coherence come from? And if I could be when I apologize for I'm obviously talking to what I would call here, not first simplicity, I hope, but what I call second simplicity. It's the simplicity after complexity. And I could speak in second simplicity terms. What he essentially says is that there are simple first rules that are iterated, repeated again and again. And those simple first rules of reality generate coherence. In a word, Turing morphogenesis. Now, what I realized reading him was that's not just true about exteriors, it's also true about interiors. In other words, you can't create coherence in the world just based on mechanics, because the world's not just mechanics. The world is mechanics and music intertextured, intertwined. Mathematics doesn't just measure mechanics. Mathematics is a mathematics of intimacy, right? There's a music to cosmos. Cosmos is Nietzsche understood as mechanics and music, right? Inseparable. Pythagoras understands the relationship between mathematics, right, and music as flip sides, both forms of disclosures of the intimate universe. So if we get that, so you get, so how do you create coherent complexity, meaning 8 billion people, only a couple billion just a few decades ago, all running in different directions. How do you create coherence? And Skinner, by the way, was also not a demon, right? Skinner was not this bad guy, Skinner at Harvard. Skinner actually got existential risk decades before everyone did. He was a reductive materialist. He wanted to fucking save the world. He didn't know how to do it. He couldn't believe in human possibility. So he basically said, the only thing we can do is create a Skinner's box. But in other words, I don't think he wasn't doing it because he was a demonized green lizard, suggested in various forms and some sort of bad cabal conspiracy with Bill Gates at the center. He was actually trying to figure it out. And what he figured out is, well, if there's no value in the world, then there's no real Eros, and love's not real, and there's no freedom. The only thing I can do is let's create a box where we control the game. So Skinner got it. And Skinner, he got existential risk. But actually, let's go back to Turing to morphogenesis. What I extrapolated from Turing was the realization that you create coherence in the world, that reality creates coherence through simple first principles and first values. Just like there are simple first rules, which are mechanics, there's the simple first principles and first values of reality. They have to be simple. And what are the simplest things? So it's the answer to 3 questions. Where am I? Who am I? What ought I do? What should I do? So it's where am I and where are we? Question 1, a where question. Question 2, a who question. Who am I? But it's that simple, because I'm going to plug in excuse me, everybody. I just see the little red coming up. I just plug in, so I apologize. Who am I? Who am I? Who are we? And then what should I do? What ought I do? So everyone has an implicit, inescapable framework, Charles Taylor's phrase, that I live in that answers these questions. No one doesn't. And these are not made up answers. We can actually integrate the best information available in the world from the entire traditional period, the entire modern period, the entire postmodern period, read across disciplines. That's what Zach and Ken and I and others are trying to do. And then integrate into a second simplicity, not a first simplicity, a second simplicity after complexity, a second simplicity, the best answers we have available at this moment in time to those 3 questions. That's we're going to call that a new story of value. And a new story of value changes history. Take it away. I have a lot more, but please, I don't want to.
Not at all. This is great, Mark. My brain is going like at 180 miles per hour.
It's beautiful. You begin to see it. It's beautiful. So we have to answer these 3 questions, but we can't make up the answer, my friend.
No. And here's where my question comes in. And also to recap that succinctly, at the core of what you are communicating, what you're writing about, is that there has been this devastating collapse of intrinsic value, which is at the center of our culture. and that we need to evoke a new story of value, right, as a response to this meta crisis. And so when you talk about finding the best answers available, looking across all these times and philosophies and cultures, first of all, how do you determine what the best answer is? What is the criteria? Because there's many answers to certain questions, and each side thinks they got the right answer. Even if we just look at something, just the topic of religion, and one flavor of praying to God, the universe, the cosmos says this is the only way, this is the right way. The other one saying no, this is the right way, and you deserve to die for your way. So this is just even picking religion. So how do you determine what the right answer is, and who determines this?
So that's a great question. So it's not a council that sits and says, oh, we like this one. No, actually, if you actually do the work, which pretty much no one does, right? People just talk, and they talk in surface arguments in which they identify, oh, my identity is this religion, my identity is this value. They don't actually enter the value. They don't enter what I would call the field of value. They identify with a particular position. Then they spend the rest of their life proving that their position is right, which is idiocy, right? Actually, go ahead.
Quick question. So explain to us the field of value. We're entering the field of value versus just talking about values and defending it.
Let's go slow. What we can do is, it is possible, and we've done it, to actually, but we've done it 18 hours a day for 30 years. We've been working on it. It's not a, let me read a couple of books, let me write a little bestseller, it's 6 steps. It doesn't work that way. Nothing works that way. You don't become the best physicist in the world. You don't become the best athlete in the world. You don't become the best human being that you can be, right? It's a journey of a lifetime. And we've, in our kind of fast moving world where you don't even know how to read anymore, we've forgotten that actually greatness is cumulative. Greatness requires mad sacrifice, mad passion, mad love, mad eros, mad commitment. It requires getting up again after it all falls apart, right? And so it requires living in the holy and broken hallelujah of life, right? As our friend Leonard reminded us, right? There's a blaze of light in every word. It doesn't matter what you heard, right? It's all hallelujah. And actually weaving together a level of beauty that comes from, and here's what I would call it. We actually can weave together the validated insights, according to the best authorities in every field, the validated insights from each wisdom discipline, and then string them together, synergize them, and create a new whole. Although, for example, let's give you an example. Let me give you like a dumb example. In the world of molecular biology, there's 4 or 5 different basic approaches. Having said that, underlying all those approaches, there's a set of shared validated insights, right? And physics is a little more complex, but basically, again, in physics, whether or not we're going Copenhagen interpretation, whether we're going the great Einstein argument about spooky distance, right, spooky action at distance, or we're going with John Archibald Wheeler, right, a participatory universe, however we're going to play, there's a set of core understandings about how the universe functions. And those core understandings actually form the core of consensus in, for example, science. Right? And what we do now, there's a lot of problems in what are called peer-reviewed journals. Peer-reviewed journals like Nature, like Lancet, have actually been hijacked by special interests, but that's a separate problem, right? The corruption of the peer review process, I'm not going to talk about right now. But in general, there's a way to establish a shared consensus about the fundamental validated understandings. And that's how we build a rocket ship, right? How do we build a rocket ship? Well, there's lots of differences in science, right? How can we possibly build a rocket ship? We can, right? Because, right, we actually say, okay, this is a shared understanding, and this is a shared understanding about electromagnetism, and this is a shared understanding about this piece of astrophysics, and we put together a rocket ship that manages to land on the moon. It is completely possible to actually integrate the validated insights, which are self-evidently validated by the leaders in the field, that generate certain results. So nothing's based on faith in the sense of, I'm claiming this to be true. We're always using the experimental method, but the experimental method works not only in the exterior sciences, it works in the interior sciences, and I call them, it's a word I made up, I call them the interior sciences. Instead of using words like mysticism, religion, which are very complicated words, there are interior sciences. And just there's enough physics to build a rocket ship to land on the moon, there's enough interior science to actually build a vision of value that's intrinsic and not made up. Makes perfect sense, just no one bothers doing it, right? And so it has to be done. And there's a false assumption at play, and we can cut to the core of this, which is, in order to tell a new story of value, let's go back. We'll bring everyone back. Is that okay? Let's go back. We say to create a new world is to tell a new story of value. So in other words, it's only a new story of value that changes the vector of history. As we face existential risk, the only response that actually reshapes reality is a new story, but not a made-up new story in the postmodern sense, but an actual new story of value based on the validated insights integrated from pre-modern and postmodern thought that put a rocket ship on the moon, that form a new story of value, which are the best answers to where are we? Who are we? What ought I do? So let's play with those for a second if we can.
Yes, please.
So the best answer to where are we is, I would say, we live in an intimate universe. It's a beautiful sentence, and I do not mean it mythopoetically. Meaning, this is not a lovely mythopoetic way to talk, meaning it's a hard materialist universe, but isn't it poignant and beautiful? No, we live in an intimate universe. Intimacy is the fundamental structure of reality. Now, for that to be true, I have to actually explain what I mean by intimacy.
Yes.
So let's go do that in a second. But let me say it a different way before we do that. We live in, I'll give another way of saying the same thing. Reality is Eros. All the way up and all the way down. And by the way, not that we're against sex is great, but there are 12 billion years of Eros before any sex. Right, 12 billion years of Eros. So Eros is the structure of reality. Reality is Eros all the way up and all the way down. Just three. Reality moves towards, reality has a desire for, an appetite for, an appetition for more and more wholeness or more and more value. Okay, now those are that's a bunch of big thoughts, but those are not poetic declarations. My colleague David White says essentially, I'm a materialist, but let me write you good poetry. That's not what we got. That's not going to move us today. That's not what we need today. Well, David's doing a great job, but that's what we need is actually knowing that value is backed by the universe, that love is actually real. Now, let's go slow together for a second. First, let's go back. We say we live in an intimate universe. What is intimacy? What does intimacy mean? And here's the thing. Intimacy means the same thing all the way down the evolutionary chain and all the way up the evolutionary chain. Now, intimacy also evolves. There's an evolution of intimacy. You might even say that reality is the evolution of intimacy, or reality is the progressive deepening of intimacies. That's the structure of reality. So let's see, what does that mean? Let's check. So what we've done is we've created 18 interior science equations, if you will. And I'm using the word equations in a kind of literary sense. So here's an equation. And maybe we can even write it and we can put it across the screen when we play the podcast. But it's a simple equation, which is intimacy equals shared identity. Let's just start. That's the first part. It's 3 parts. Intimacy equals shared identity. So in the context of otherness, so let's say I become really good friends with someone, but such good friends that it's like we're part of each other. Or let's say I marry someone, or I've got a brother or a sister, or I have a close friend, or I've got a colleague, right? It's not just that we're functional friends in a win-lose metrics, and we can each use each other to help us get ahead in a particular success story. No, we're actually intimate. We have shared identity. That's what intimacy means. We begin to actually break the egocentric, narrow isolation. I step out of my isolation And actually, there's some part of me that's dead without you, right? Some part of me shows up only when I'm talking to you. You're part of my identity. You evoke my identity. And if you weren't in the world, I'd be devastated. And here's the crazy thing. I might even be willing to die for you. Tom Hanks, and it brings tears to my eyes. Tom Hanks and Steve Spielberg did a very beautiful thing. They made a Netflix series called Easy Company, which is about the boys, right? The boys who stormed the beaches of Normandy. And these incredible boys. I said, oh my God. You look, Hanks has been obsessed with this for many years. And he did a movie, what was it, 20 years ago? Right, called Saving Private Ryan. Right? When you see these boys, and when people talk about men are bad, like this kind of critique and problematization of the masculine, I say, really? Let's talk about the boys who stormed the beaches of Normandy. These beautiful boys, farm boys from Iowa and Montana, and they know that half of them are not going to survive that beachhead. And it's hard to talk about without crying, right? And they have this sense of intimacy with reality, ordinary boys.
Shared identity.
Identity.
So
they don't disappear, right? Please.
This is where you've written about in the book that at the base of this meta crisis that we're experiencing is what you call this global intimacy disorder. So it's basically a global shared identity disorder. The capacity to connect, basically seeing the differences first versus what unites us.
We'll go slow, but yes, no, but. Just an and, right? So I'm going to follow with your permission, your direction. So intimacy, shared identity in the context of otherness, meaning it's not fusion. It's not a totalitarian fusion. We actually exist. We're distinct. Times mutuality of recognition. We recognize each other. Times mutuality of pathos, of feeling. We feel each other, right? Times mutuality of value. We have a shared field of value. Times mutuality of purpose. We now have shared purpose. Now, here's where it gets completely wild. So whether it's the boys storming the beach of Normandy, whether it's Ariane, Lady A, with whoever she's close to in the world, whether it's Mark, or whether it's a proton and a neutron who are allergic to each other, they come together, they create a shared identity, which is called an atom. But it's a shared identity in the context of otherness because the proton and the neutron still exist in some way. They haven't disappeared, right? The proton and the neutron obviously recognize each other, right? Self-evidently, I could go into the science. They feel each other. We could do the science, but self-evident. They have a shared field of value. That's how you can do it. That's how it works. So they're operating in a shared field of value, which would allows them to create this new wholeness. And they have a new shared purpose, which is what atoms do, whatever atoms do. So that intimacy equation of the interior science stunningly applies to subatomic particles. It applies to boys in the beaches of Normandy. Right? It applies to my friend Fern, who met with 4 girlfriends. Right? They were all executives in Boca Raton, Florida, and they'd all had great successful careers. And they moved to Boca Raton, Florida, and they all met each other every Tuesday night at the Tuesday Night Club for 30 years. These 4 great women who loved each other, and they were family to each other, and they were intimate. They had shared identity, and they stood right. They didn't know each other. They didn't come from the same family, but they chose to have shared identity in the context of otherness. And it applies. Let's give it a couple up. It applies to. It applies to different parts of myself. For example, if I split off parts of myself, it means I have no shared identity with that part. And so I need to actually know all the voices in me. We have shared identity in the context of otherness, but I can distinguish each of the voices: my protector, my controller, my insecure child, my ambitious one. So we have to be intimate. These different parts have to have shared identity. In the context of otherness, the parts need to be able to talk to each other, which means they've got to recognize each other. The parts have to feel each other. And my friend Dick Schwartz, who's does something called internal family systems, and Lori Galpern, who's also an expert at it, they're about creating intimacy between these parts that recognize each other, that feel each other, that have a shared field of value together, and that then can come together and create shared purpose. And the opposite of that is basically schizophrenia and mental dissociation and breakdown. So it's applied intimacy to subatomic particles, the boys of Easy Company, storming the beaches of Normandy, to Ariane and the four closest people in her life, whoever they might be, to Mark and his life. And I give us a blessing that we become friends and we go deep, because everyone's not an it. It's not like I'm meeting Lady A and I need to get this book in the world. And so let me do her podcast. That's like a horror. My actual experiences, I'm so delighted to be here. I'm so delighted to be in your presence. I'm delighted to feel this quality of Lady A-ness that I've never felt in the world ever before. It's something new. It's unique. It's distinct. It's got a quality. It's got a taste. It evokes, right, a field. That's what intimacy means. I'm curious about who is that and what is that? It's not functional. It's not instrumental. And from any meeting comes depth, right? Comes intimacy, comes the potential of shared identity at all of its different levels. And I can have shared identity with my dog. I can be literally intimate with my dog, and I can have with a close friend or my son, but they're all intimacy, or organizations or nations or self. All of a sudden, look what we just did. We just established an equation which governs. It took me 10 years to formulate this equation. So it sounds simple, but it's actually, I played with so many different versions of it. But once we got it, it was like, that works across all fields of reality.
You
so
said
reality.
you said something critical to me before that I'd like to dissect a little more. So this equation, as far as it relates to human beings, and you share the story of your friend Fern and her lovely lady friend. So a word that struck me was choice. To choose this, where I find, looking at our human world and what's happening in it nowadays, it seems that more often than not, this choice even isn't in the forefront of our minds. And if you look at the way you talk about Eros, it's Eros way beyond just the romantic Eros in the sense of the cosmos, a broader sense of aliveness and engagement with life, all the different parts of life, engaging with each other, being intimate with each other. So with regard to choice in our human context, can you elaborate on how we as individuals can cultivate this expansive understanding of Eros and also the choosing that comes with it in
That's great.
a
That's great.
relationship?
I love that. I love that. I love that. So let's go back a step. Let's go to Eros and then go to choice. Okay. So Eros is also one of the first, and in this book, there's 18 first principles and first values. I'm looking for the book on my desk, but it's someplace. But there's 18 first principles and first values. One of them is intimacy. And we just went through the interior science equation of intimacy. And we saw in a relatively small amount of time, 7-8 minutes, that it applies across domains. The same thing's true about the Eros equation. The same thing's true about choice. But let's go slow. But I'm going to just add one thing in, which we need, which is, I'm going to call it the principle of continuity and discontinuity. It's a critical principle, right? And the principle states as follows. There's continuity. So intimacy works all the way up and all the way down. Ariane, if she was going out, she wouldn't go out with a proton, right? If she was at the going out stage of her life, right? And you and I don't know anything about each other's personal lives. But at some point, you may be in that now, but at some point, you definitely were in it, I would assume. Whenever that was, you wouldn't have chosen a proton to go out with. It'd be a weird thing to do. There's really interesting protons, compelling. I'm going to go out with that proton. It's a little weird. Right now, you may have a kind of pet, a dog that you're very intimate with, but you wouldn't go out with the dog. Well, why? Because intimacy evolves, right? In other words, there's intimacy. The same formula, the equation applies to subatomic particles, but the equation applies across the board, but the nature, the quality, the interior experience of intimacy evolves, just like it evolves within the human life, right? In other words, you can be in a relationship where you begin with a certain kind of intimacy. You think, wow, we really got this great relationship, and then it all falls apart. And then either you leave, which often is the right thing to do, not always, but the times when it's not the right thing to do, you actually stay. You say, okay, this is where I'm going to stay. I'm going to stay here and do the work. It can get hard, but I'm staying here. you actually can get to unimaginably beautiful intimacy. I remember once, if I can, I was in Jerusalem and I was giving a talk late night, this kind of weekly talk someplace in this artist colony outside the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. And so I leave the talk and it's late at night and I've got this crazy pile of books, like I always did. And I see coming towards me, I'm looking down because I'm carrying the books, and I feel this insane energy coming towards me. So I look up and I see this couple, and I'm like, huh. So I flitted into the shadows, and they're like this, and I shouldn't have looked, but I did. Now I have to tell you, she must have been like 170. She couldn't have been a day. She couldn't have been a day younger than 170. He was probably 185. They walked so slow that they were walking backwards, and they were so beautiful. Like you're like you could feel like, who are they? And I'm like it was like gut. And so I watched them, and then there's this moment I can remember it where she trips a little bit, and I look down. They don't see me. He looks down, and her shoelace is untied. So he bends down like really slowly, and he was probably the archetype of arthritis. So it probably took him like he finally gets down, and she's standing there like this regal queen, and he ties her shoe. And it's hard for him, like slowly. And then he gets up slowly, and they exchange this look just for a split second. And you could see like all of the pain and all of the tragedy and all of the goodness and all of the joy and all of the betrayal, perhaps. And they stayed. And here they were, right? And they were what I call post-tragic, right? And they were, right? And there's, no matter how beautiful your love is at 18 and how wonderful your first sexing is and how you're in love forever, it doesn't even vaguely approximate what this king and queen, 185 years old, had. So even within the human world, there's this dramatic evolution of intimacy. So intimacy, the intimacy equation applies across the board in all domains, all of the world of matter, all of the world of life, the biosphere, all of the world of the mind, the noosphere. But there's this constant evolution of intimacy. And there's this principle of continuity and discontinuity, meaning there's a continuity of intimacy, but there's also jumps where intimacy jumps to higher levels. Or like Stephen Jay Gould talked about punctuated equilibria. So we could talk about there's these jumps in evolution. So the same thing's true about Eros. The same thing's true about choice, right? And by choice, we mean something like freedom. But there's some degree of freedom in the system. Now, this is so, and I'm so delighted and not surprised that you're pointing to it because it's so important. So you'll have a writer like my colleague in Israel, which is the place I lived for many years, and it's a beautiful and torn and tragic and stunning place, and in multiple levels. And mad blessing for every innocent person that's been tragically killed in Gaza. And mad blessing to Israel as a pluralistic democracy in the Middle East, right? Which is standing for all value in the world and actually saying no to the degraded forms of jihad, which include systemized, sexualized violence of the most vicious kind that we've ever seen, and the tragedies of war. And my son has been in Gaza for a good part of the last several months, who's in a combat unit, and he's himself personally lost, he told me the other day, 10 friends in the last 4 months. So it's an insane moment, right? So this notion of freedom, but that there's some degree, we talked about Israel and I lost my thread and I went into too many faces for a second. So let me just mad blessings to the Holy Land.
Yes.
So this notion that there is freedom, but that freedom increases. So I was talking about my colleague in Israel. That's how we segued, Yuval Harari. And Yuval writes a book called Homo Sapiens, Homo Deus. And Yuval just flat out says, there's no free will. It's completely made up. Like Yuval, right? And then, of course, when the Ukrainian war started 2 years ago, so Yuval writes like all of his kind of popular newspaper articles in The Guardian, people need to exercise their choice and free will. But 1 second, Yuval, you just told everybody that free will is an illusion, right? And Robert Sapolsky, I think the book's behind me or someplace, right? Here's Robert's book. This came out, right? Again, no free will, right?
Mhm.
My colleague Sam Harris, no free will, but repeating. Sam's basically a very good, when he adds something to it, popularizer of that position. Atlantic Magazine, the center of liberal America, runs a story a number of years ago, is free will real? No one would have run a story like that 50 years ago, right?
Mm.
You actually can't have a conversation, as Habermas points out, without, as we're talking now, we have an experience between us that there's some degree of freedom in the conversation, right? If we didn't have that experience, we couldn't have the conversation. We would feel like talking puppets, even though there's antecedent causation, meaning obviously Lady A is formed by her world and Mark is formed by his world, and there's lots of things that go into forming our sentences. Nonetheless, I can feel, and you can feel directly, that within our communicative action, within our conversation, there's some degree of freedom, and that's its joy. So you can't even experience yourself in the world, right, in any way without some degree of freedom. Now, we may have much less freedom than we thought in many ways, and we need to acknowledge all the ways that we're influenced, and that's part of becoming free.
Mhm.
Actually, when I begin to, right, please.
About the experiencing oneself without a degree of freedom. So I think we get to experience parts of ourselves even when we're living in very unfree circumstances. I personally cannot put myself in the shoes, and I thank the universe for it, for someone who has been just subjugated their entire lives, whether it's in our country by, let's say, growing up in a violent family, or whether you grow up somewhere in a country where your basic freedoms are just stripped from you and where you can be put into jail just for showing your hair and not covering it up. That being said, we still get to experience at least parts of ourselves, but certainly not the self-actualized parts of ourselves, not what I would call the highest self. Some people, the search for meaning, some people do, but for most of us, we would likely retract into a very basic form of ourselves, to say so, which is also why for me, freedom and love for myself are the absolute core values.
Absolutely,
And I will
absolutely,
defend that not just for myself, but for anybody else to
totally.
experience that and to live that.
And
But
that's where the death of our humanity happens. When we talk at the beginning of the death of humanity and the death of our humanity, it's actually the robbing of our essential freedom. And what the internet techplex is doing is an active kind of Walden 2, Skinner, which creates an immersive environment of the web where we can no longer place attention. Our attention is hijacked, fragmented, and scattered. Human beings are reduced to their lowest common denominator, and we take all of our decisions through what Kahneman called fast thinking, and there's actually no free will.
Mhm.
And actually, what Skinner was talking about, beyond, the name of his book was Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And Pentland, right, at the MIT Media Lab, although he makes a couple of clever moves to try and hide it, which I won't go into now, essentially has adopted lock, stock, and barrel that position, right? As has most of the designers of the apps in the Techplex. Let's see if I can grab something back here. Let's see. Let's pick up this one. This just happens to be, I'm finishing Techno-Feudalism, right? This is a very well-known book within the Techplex. It's called Evil by Design.
Mhm.
He's being clever and cute, but essentially the author is saying, this is read by every designer, every app designer, is we can actually take away people's free will. We can actually create addiction, which they call constant engagement, by actually learning how to distract and direct their attention. And if you've ever watched, by the way, A Good Magician,
Yeah, recently.
attention, who
Yes.
directs your attention, you realize, oh, that's essentially what the Techplex is doing. It's robbing us of freedom. And so freedom is essential, and there's an evolution of freedom. But maybe we can go back to the last issue, right? Which is, how do we know these values are real? How do we know love's real? And it's what's the claim? And it's why do people like Skinner? Why does the whole Techplex? Why does Alex Pentland as at the social media, the MIT Media Lab? My guess is also, by the way, that core figures in, I'd say Bill Gates pretty much has adopted a position where free will is not real. I'd say Barack Obama pretty much has adopted that position. If you follow his speeches, he endorsed, for just, it's a minor example, but he actually endorses Homo sapiens, loves the book, and isn't disturbed by it. Same with Gates, same with Bezos, Jeffrey, and a whole host of other people. Now, in a book like Homo sapiens and Homo Deus, essentially, Harari, not as a thinker, but he's a parrot of the postmodern moment and a parrot of kind of the classical position in the Western Academy, says freedom's not real and value's not real. Now, I want to just get this clear. If you had a president of the United States 100 years ago who endorses a book, this is a great book, no qualms, that says that value is not real, love's not real, you'd have this insane outcry. No one even noticed, right?
No. And the issue is also here that we are so bombarded with value being something extrinsic, right? Value is something where you put money on, where you get something out of.
Exiled value to economic commodified value.
Yeah, exactly.
When value is actually about the priceless. It's
Yes.
about the immeasurable.
Yeah. So the value of a stream is not the intrinsic value of a stream anymore. The value of the stream is what can it make someone, whether
and of a person. Right? As we, a piece of wood, it becomes lumber instead of a tree, and a whale becomes whale oil,
and a human being becomes a consumer.
Becomes a consumer, it becomes successful or unsuccessful in playing in the win-lose metrics of a system in which all value is measured and commodified, and it never has intrinsic value. So how do we reestablish intrinsic value?
Here's something I want to add to that. So you say a win-lose metric, something that I've been thinking on about for a while. So we always tend to think things are the way they are because that's how they're presented to us. Something as simple as the concept of a game. Now, most games that we witness growing up, or whether it's sports, whether it's Monopoly or card games or whatever game it is, I'm pretty sure that probably 95+% of the games that I grew up at or that I witness are games where there's a winner and there's losers. Maybe there's a winning team, but there's losing teams. But are no games that are in our psyche, in the forefront of our minds, where it's everybody wins. I don't know. So this shapes our perception in such fundamental ways, also towards life.
And video games are an expression of that dimension of reality. And it's not that there's not a place for competition. There is.
Sure.
And there's a place for holistic hierarchy. Not everyone is the same. Right. So it's not a leveling of differences. It's not an erasing of competition. It's not an erasing of merit. And it's not saying also there should be equal outcomes always in the world. There has to be equal opportunity, equal outcomes aren't the same. So I think you're right. Our games do reflect our values. But let's get under values to value, right? Because actually, it's very beautiful. Before there's any meaning and before there's any values, there's value. And this goes back to your question, what's the field of value? There's a field of value. And so here we can play for a second. We have a few minutes, but let's see if we can go at listeners, right? You're in Lady A's world. If you're willing to do like a deep dive for 2 minutes, I promise you'll get it. But we got to do a deep dive for a second, because otherwise you never really get what's going on out there. You're my old friend. I haven't seen him in a long time. He's a beautiful person. We had a deep dive at some point. He made a movie, Lana, called The Matrix, right? And that what he meant by the Matrix is you're just not aware of what's going on around you. You're asleep, fundamental way. You can't understand what's happening in the world today without understanding the issue of value. Why does Skinner, why does Harari, why does postmodernism, why does much of modernity, David Hume, why does Jonathan Haidt, who just put out a book on, which is a very good book on the anxious generation, but you have a chill when you read the book because all of them assume value is not real. Mm-hmm. All of them, all of those people, they all assume value is not real. It's contrived. It's a result of a random cosmos, which is generating a random structure, but value is ultimately not an intrinsic structure backed by the universe as an actual living, breathing truth. So why do they assume that? So they assume it. We don't have time to do a kind of dive into the 10 key points of value theory, but let's just do one point, which everyone will get. Let's take love. Yeah. So a parent 1,500 years ago has a disobedient child. So they slap the child 10 times hard in order to create obedience. And the child appreciates being disciplined, right? The society rewards them, right? They've been a good parent. They love their child. That's why they're slapping them that hard. This is love, right? We're now in 2024, and a parent slaps a child that hard that actually the neighbor calls child services, and they're right. They should, because no parent should slap their child that hard, right? And it actually is borderline into abuse. So that's so unloving. So the critique of value is those are both called love. They're completely contradictory to each other. So obviously, love is just a social construct. Mm-hmm. That's a very powerful argument. I mean, that's a very concise way to summarize a huge swath of literature. But basically, that's the very core of it. That's very compelling. My friend Howard Bloom is a beautiful man, wrote a book called The Lucifer Principle, which was quite influential. And that's Howard's argument. That's the argument. There's some version of that's Harari's argument. When Harari, he says it in multiple ways, but he basically says there's no essential difference, this is his conclusion, between Gaddafi's Libya and universal human rights. It's a dramatic, chapter 2, Sapiens. That's a dramatic thing to say, and it's dead wrong. But that's the assumption of the leading edge of legacy institutions in the world today, both in closed societies and open societies. Whether you're in China, Russia, or the center of the American Academy, that's the assumption, which is why, by the way, people have such a confused time calling Hamas evil. Right? Guys, are we confused here? Do we think that pounding nails into women as you cut off their breasts and rape them and then murder them? Why is that confusing? That's evil. That's not confusing, right? And Israel may or may not make 10 mistakes, right? But for example, when this tragedy happened last week, where inadvertently, right, 7 aid workers were killed, which is a horror, Israel took 2 of its top most officers who spend their entire lives working with the country and threw them out because of their mistake. So they, in the middle of a war, there's complete accountability. And my son has described to me the amount of his friends that have gotten killed because of taking extreme precaution in the field to do everything they could do, right? To actually get the best centers of command are in hospitals and in schools, in which Hamas is essentially holding the Gazan population hostage and trying to actually make the death count as high as possible. It's an absurd situation, but can we not get this straight? Is this confusing? So the reason it's confusing is because value is not real. Values look to be completely contrived. It's completely made up. Value is not made up. Mm-hmm. So how is it not made up? How is it true that love is real if actually love means something 2,000 years ago and love seems to mean something completely different today? So the answer is there is nonetheless what we would call a common shared understanding of love. We call that, for example, the Eros equation. Love is Eros. And actually, Eros always means, there's always a shared, no matter whether it's 2,000 years ago, the parent slapping the kid, whether it's today, calling child services and the parent who slaps the kid. So huge difference in how we're using the word love. Nonetheless, there's still a basic understanding of Eros or love. So here's the Eros equation. Eros equals the experience of radical aliveness, desiring ever deeper contact and ever greater wholeness or ever greater value. That's an Eros equation. It's in the book First Principles and First Values. There's an entire book I wrote on it called Return to Eros, or Return to Eros, which is an entire book on Eros, but that's what it means always. Now, Eros evolves. There's an evolution of love, right? Eros, but there's still a core understanding of Eros, which is I care for, I take care of, right? I protect, right? I nourish, right? Now, what it means to protect and nourish might change over time. That's true. It might deepen just like it does, but there's a basic understanding that this is an expression that love is backed by the universe.
Yes. And simply because yes. And just because we humans use different definitions of it at different times, that does not mean it does not exist.
And there's a common core that
Yes.
all of those different definitions have a common core. There's an evolution of love, but it's an evolution of love. There's an evolution of intimacy, like there's an evolution of choice. There's an evolution of freedom. There's an evolution of uniqueness, but there are core first principles and first values, and those are the plot lines of Cosmos.
Yes.
And it's a story that has plot lines, please.
I dare say, Mark, that it's actually not the evolution of love itself. It's the evolution of us human beings being able to tune in, express, accept, live love as what it in essence is.
That's a very big question. It's a beautiful formulation. Let's go with it for now, right? And I think there's a lot of depth. It's a beautiful formulation, right? Let's say it this way. Love is an eternal essence, and it's an evolving essence. So when I use the word the field of value, one of the terms that ancients used to describe the field of value would be the Tao. Now, lots of Taoists don't understand the Tao as the field of value, but I think a good reading of the Tao is the field of value. I think there's a ground. Now, what the field of value means, before any specific value, there's a field of value. Before any meaning, and it's deep, there's value. Meaning is a particular meaning, a particular code of information, a particular value, choice, life, or values. But underneath choice and life, let's say there's a pro-choice, pro-life argument around abortion. Underneath those two contradictory values, there's something deeper, value itself. So both choice and life are expressions of the field of value. If I don't get that, and I say choice is my identity or life is my identity, then neither of them are in the field of value, and then they clash with each other and they polarize. Both choice and life are values, but they're individuated expressions of the field of value. So the field of value is the field of consciousness, the field of value. Now there's an individuated expression of that field that's called life, that's called choice. But they're both value before their choice. I'm value before I'm life. So we share together value. Now we can synergize. Now we can talk. Now we can be in dialectical relationship because it's no longer a fundamentalism. And if you look at the great traditions, if you look, let's say, at the Brahmin tradition in Hinduism and how they handle abortion, they actually honor both choice and life. If you look at the Orthodox religious Jewish tradition and at its legal response in terms of abortion, you'll see that position is not pro-life or pro-choice. It actually honors both values because both of them are valuable. And the pro-life, pro-choice position is absurd because what each side is saying is no field of value, just my value. You can never have too much of my value. My value is my identity. All other values get thrown out. That's called idolatry. That creates polarization. And they both assume there's no field of value. That's the postmodern liberal position, which is pro-choice, no field of value. The only thing we have is choice. But the church position, the fundamentalist church position in America of pro-life also says there's no field of value. It says there's just my dogmatic fundamentalist position. And anyone who's outside of it, who's not speaking in tongues the way I do, is damned anyways. That's not the field of value. That's a fundamentalist dogmatic position. There's no field of value. So both sides are not in the field of value. So instead of their particular value, choice, life, being an expression of the field, it's actually an identity. That's my value. That's my identity. No one compromises on their identity. So they both destroyed the field of value. That's wow. So the jihad in its beautiful Islamic expression, means to do battle within yourself to become whole. Stunning. Beautiful. Read the 6,000 kind of great writers, of which Rumi, the great Rumi, was only one of them, who writes the most incredible poetry of Eros and realization. So you see the gorgeousness of Islam and of jihad at its best. But the way jihads have been hijacked today in the leading expressions of so much, tragically, of so much of Islam in the world is completely the opposite. There's Dar el Harb and Dar el Islam. There's Islam and there's the people who should die by the sword. So that's not a field of value. That is anyone outside of my very narrow group, the Sunnis. It's not just Islam, it's the Sunnis or the Shiites or everyone else should be destroyed. That's not a field of value. Yes. Right? And so a field of value means there's a universal grammar of value, which has in it self-evident intrinsic values, but we can actually validate them. We can say, so we've actually made a list. In the First Principles and First Values book, there's actually a list of interior science equations, but none of them are declarations. We made them up. It's based on looking at the deepest validated insights across disciplines and saying, okay, what emerges from all that we can actually, okay, these are the basic values of cosmos. Now, once we do that, we have a shared language. Because you can only create intimacy if we have shared value. So if we become friends and we don't have shared value between us, we can't have intimacy. And by intimacy, we mean some sense of shared identity and shared recognition and shared value and mutuality of feeling. It's got to start with shared value. If there's no shared value, you have a global intimacy disorder.
Yes.
No shared story of value. And so we're experiencing, and maybe we'll sum it up for everyone. Last point. Let's just look at it for a second. We have global challenges, existential risk. That's how we started. The death of humanity or the death of our humanity. 1. 2, global challenges require global coordination. You can't meet global challenges without global coordination, obviously. Global coordination needs global coherence. We need global coherence, right? Global coherence needs global resonance. We need to resonate with each other. Global resonance needs global intimacy. We need to have shared intimacy. And global intimacy needs a shared story of value. If we don't have a shared story of value, we can't create global intimacy, which means there's no global resonance, which means there's no global coherence, which means we can't have global coordination, which means we can't respond to the global challenges of existential risk. Game over. The root cause of existential risk is not infrastructure problems, right? How do we find bioweapons in wastewater? Although that's a good idea to solve. And it's not social structure, although we need new social structures and new law and new regulation. Those are really important. But the real issue is what Marvin Harris elliptically called superstructure. And by superstructure, the way I'm going to use the word is a shared story of value. Not just tell a new story of value and not just make one up, but actually ground that story in the Tao.
Yeah.
Ground that story in the field of value, and it can be done.
Yes.
Right. And anyone who thinks it can't actually doesn't know history. And this is maybe the last thing, and I, with your permission, and just so delighted to be here. But people say, like when I talk about this, people say that's not realistic. No, it's actually the most realistic thing in the world. In other words, the nature of the real is that it evolves and changes. So when Da Vinci is in the Renaissance and they're being destroyed by the Black Death, and it's this time between worlds and this time between stories, Da Vinci and Marcello Ficinio at the Florentine Platonic Academy, they understand they need to tell a new story. And that new story created modernity. To the extent they got the plot lines right, we got the dignities of modernity. To the extent they got the plot lines wrong, we got the disasters of modernity. So we're now at this moment again of this time between worlds and time between stories. And we need to come together and actually tell this new story of value. And that's what David J. Temple, who's the pseudo-anonymous authorship of the books, and myself and Zach, and in this one, Ken Wilber. And if I can, with your permission, if anyone would like to know what they can do, and this quite seriously, there's no profit made from it, get the book, read the book. It'll be in the show notes, I'm sure. But First Principles, the values you can get on Amazon, read it, talk to us, and become part of it.
And there's something else,
I'd like
Mark.
to talk to you. Please.
Yeah, you've been so generous with your time. I know we need a wrap. And just to wrap this really thought-inspiring conversation up, I would like to end it on a note of something that you also mentioned in the book that I find so crucial. And it is, in essence, the democratization of heroism. And from what I gathered, your vision for the democratization of heroism is extremely timely in this time between stories, between worlds, and it's also very inspiring, suggesting that every individual has a role to play in the evolution of our collective story, and not only of the survival, but the thriving of humanity. The title of this podcast alone gives it away: Superhumanize. I'm an eternal optimist. I believe in some humanity 2.0. Becoming heroes, being heroes, living up to the hero inside of ourselves. And people can read it in the book. You outline it. But as a quick takeaway, what first steps can individuals take to awaken and embody their heroic potential in daily life?
Ariane, that's gorgeous. That's a beautiful place to end. And we end here. And I hope we talk again. And because you just if I can, with your permission, I can just compliment you, the depth of both your listing and your question. But it's more than it's just the space that you create. So your listeners are lucky, and I'm honored and delighted to be here. So thank you, and deeply appreciated. Let's end in a funny way.
Mm-hmm.
So where are we now? We're in 2024, and we're in the beginning of the month of April. The Academy Awards were what, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, something like that. So Academy Awards, big moment, Ryan Gosling, right? I'm Just Ken. That was the big song. And Ryan was great. He's fantastic. But who is Ken in Barbie? So Barbie opens the Barbie movie, for which they created a special Golden Globes award for the best performance at the box office, right? And they did great. So you go see Barbie. When you see Barbie, you've got the same chilled feeling that you have when you finish reading my friend Yuval Harari, my colleague Yuval Harari's book, Homo Sapiens. You're slightly chilled. You're like, what's wrong here? And the sets are great, and the songs are great, and it's fun, but it's also chilling, because what the movie is saying is two things. One, there are no heroes. So the movie begins with Ken saying, I only exist when Barbie's looking at me. Barbie's looking at me, I have a good day. Barbie's not looking at me, I have a bad day, which is, of course, the experience of anyone in love. But Ken represents patriarchy. So they place the reality of love in the mouth of patriarchy. The point of the movie, if you listen to it carefully, and there's about 7 pieces and it's a different conversation, but the point is not that this Barbie doesn't love this Ken. It's that Barbie doesn't love Ken. There's no love story in the universe. The notion that reality is Eros is not true, right? It's a materialistic cosmos, right? And actually, you go be Ken, you go be Barbie. And it's not you go be Ken deepen so we can come back together. That's not what the movie's saying. The movie's saying, as Mrs. Mattel says to Barbie when she wants to become human, humans just make up meaning. There's no value. Love is not a real value of cosmos, right? Biology connections are mothers and daughters. So there's a mother-daughter love story, which is quite beautiful, that made me cry 4 times, because that's biology, that's beautiful. But actually, Barbie and Ken don't exist. And the movie begins where Ken wants to be a hero for Barbie. But what they do is the entire piece mocks the notion of the hero, which is the postmodern move, right? It mocks the hero. Now, how's Ken being a hero? He doesn't know how to do anything. So he says, I beach, right? What do you do on the beach? Do you have a lifeguard? No, I beach, right? Watch me, look. And he runs, boom, falls smack down. And he says, Barbie, were you watching? Yeah, Ken, you're so brave. And of course, the text mocks the hero. And then Barbie has a party, and Ken wants to stay over. And Barbie says, it's girls' night tonight. It's actually a girls' night every night. And then she says, forever. Now, the forever word is really important, because the word forever and love go together. When you really love someone, you say, let's love each other forever. So Barbie's saying it's the reverse of forever. It's girls' night tonight and every night forever. And when he leans over to kiss her, she's like, what are you doing? But it's not, oh, I'm the powerful, independent woman pushing away the Me Too predator. It's not that kind of important assertion of beautiful autonomy. There's no love story, not just between you and me, period. There's no love story. So love is a value of cosmos. The hero is the embodiment of value. That's what a hero is. That's the core, and we can close with it. And it's insanely beautiful, my new friend, with permission. It's insanely beautiful. A hero is valiant. A hero has valor, which of course comes from the Latin word valeria, right, or valentia, which means be strong in your worthiness, which is related to being valid because you participate in value, which is related to valentius, which is love, or eros. So eros is the value of cosmos from which your validity derives and your valor derives because you're a unique incarnation of the field of value. It comes from valence, the valences of protons and of electrons, right, which is how do they actually join together in Eros? That's the field of value. Now, the hero embodies value. So maybe this is the most beautiful conversations in which you don't design them, but just the goodness of the space brings you back exactly. So we actually have one missing thread in this conversation that we never came back to, which is exactly now we come back to, which is Easy Company, the boys flooding the beach of Normandy who are mowed down. They're heroes. They're heroes. And it's not that boys are heroes, girls are heroes, boys are heroes. But there's an incredible girl who fought off 40 terrorists, this 25-year-old young woman, and one of the kibbutzim in Israel. And there's Arab women who are incredible heroes, right? Heroes are not limited to Jews or Arabs. Human beings are heroes, men, women, young and old. But a hero means I can experience more than my separate self. Something I'm willing to die for. And that's for the field of value. And once I'm willing to die for it, don't die for it, live for it.
Beautiful, Marc. I love that.
Yay.
Yeah. Be loved is my motto. So for me, I love what you just explained. Ties right into it.
All in. And I apologize. I know that we did lots of deep structures instead of talking in a more kind of general way. And I'm sure we lost some people along the way, but it's the only way we can honor ourselves. We have to be willing now to go deep and do the real work and then let the emergence, because when you said be loved now, it so beautifully emerges from everything we said. Then when we get there, that expresses, that lifts everything. But if we would get there and just say be loved, and then just have this kind of superficial conversation, then we're lost in either fundamentalism or New Age. But your be loved was this beautiful expression of just doing this insanely beautiful dive together into what's really going on, involving love together. Yay. Thank you.
I love this conversation. Thank you for your time, Marc. And also, hopefully not the last time we talk. There's so much more to examine and do a deep dive on.
Ariane, thank you so much.